all the way my Savior leads me. Cheers each winding path I tread, gives me grace for every trial, feeds me with the living bread.
Good morning, everybody. Chester ARP Church Devotional Podcast. Clint Davis, your host. Thanks so much for being with us. We've been reading through 1 Kings. We've been in 1 Kings chapter 6 yesterday, the building of the temple. I made a couple comments about that. 1 Kings chapter 7 is a story of how after the temple is completed in chapter 6, then Solomon builds his own palace, and then the temple furnishings are completed and brought to the temple. And now we're going to pick this story up with Solomon, King Solomon in ancient Israel, reading the Bible, discussing it. 1 Kings chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, as Solomon brings the ark of the Lord to the temple. This is what we find in 1 Kings 8:1. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the leaders of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel, before King Solomon in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is in Zion. And all the men of Israel assembled to King Solomon at the feast in the month of Ethanium, which is a seventh month. And all elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark. And they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought them up, and King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel, who had assembled before him, were with him at the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted nor numbered. Then the priest brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim overshadowed the ark and its poles. And the poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from the outside. And they are there to this day. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of the stone that Moses put there at Horeb, where the Lord had made a covenant with the people of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister before the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Now this is an important point in the conclusion of the temple and the transition from the tabernacle phase to the temple phase. Prior to this, ancient Israel, the ancient Hebrews, had worshipped their God Yahweh in the tabernacle from the time of the building of the tabernacle when they were at Mount Sinai on into the establishment of the Promised Land. For hundreds of years, they had used a tabernacle, a tent, a mobile tent that would be moved from place to place as God moved his people. Now, the Ark of the Covenant was completed. The Ark of the Covenant was the place that God was to have specifically sat among his people. The top of the Ark of the Covenant was called the mercy seat. It was God's literal dwelling place on earth with his people. Now, obviously, God is a spirit, and he demonstrated his presence through the cloud. But God didn't sit as a human would sit. He didn't take on human flesh until Jesus came. But in this time, he was literally thought to have sat at the on top of the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy of holies, in the most holy place. And that is the mercy seat, where God demonstrated mercy. God gave mercy to his people. And it makes sense if you want to transition, right, from a new phase of life, that the temple that you have built, as wonderful and beautiful and all its furnishings as it is not the temple of the Lord until the ark of the presence of God is brought into that temple. So this is a significant moment in the history of God's people, but also in the worship of God's people, in the cult of Yahweh. And so they bring the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. This is a transition. The tabernacle and all of its furnishings and all of its tent poles and all that it is now taken down. The Ark of the Covenant is brought into the temple, and the transition has happened. No longer is God dwelling in a temporary location or a temporary place among his people. The people have established themselves. God has granted them grace and provision to do that. He has established them in the land, and now they are establishing a permanent location for God's worship among his people. This is an important moment. The cloud descends upon the temple, and the temple is now the dwelling place of God among his people. There's so much that we could take from this. But if we just simply applied it to a New Testament paradigm, to a New Testament church paradigm, when a church is started, so our church, the church I pastor, 150 some years, we started meeting in different locations. The church was started in 1869, meeting in a different location than it is now, obviously. And it met in a less permanent location for 10 years. In 1879, I believe it is, they built their first sanctuary. And when they built that first sanctuary, the church had arrived. It had become a permanent fixture in the landscape of the Chester community, its community. While it was in a temporary location, it was meeting, it was worshiping, it was the people of God. But it hadn't become a permanent fixture in that community as a testimony to the glory and majesty of God. Now Solomon, being the king of the kingdom that's been established by God's grace, is showing the people through building the temple that God is a permanent dweller among his people. He is a permanent, he has a permanent location, a permanent testimony to his glory, to his majesty, to his goodness, to his people, to remind them. And that's important. Brick and mortar matters because it signifies permanence. And God is permanent. And when a church establishes itself and a church builds a building and a church has a place among its community, it's the establishment of the place of God among his community. A permanent presence is a permanent testimony. And we do that. That's why we put roots down. We do that not just with churches, we do it with our personal lives. That's why we put roots down. That's why we get connected. We want to be permanently located in a community. One, it's for our benefit. It's for the good of our community. But two, it is the testimony of God among the world of his glory and of his permanence in a community. We see that here, and I think it's a tremendously important time in the history of God's people. You guys take care. God bless you. I'll see you tomorrow.
You carry me close to your heart.